Constitution, Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
That my network is quite choppy. Sorry about that. All right, PIs in the chat. All right. I'll take one from CO. I'll probably also take OO. Yeah. Just give me a second. All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. All right, panel. I think as OG, we have such a high burden, but I'm just going to try and prove it because I think what necessarily this is basically dueling. Like we're going to have a space where people can come and do whatever they want to each other and then leave. Just modeling 6 parts. Firstly, why is it going to happen? For the purposes of this debate, the main arena will be the Colosseum in Rome, but every region will have their own place where they can be able to fight. There will be 3 levels. There can be individual. We can create different categories. For example, individual dueling. There can be interstate dueling, where exactly every state brings their best actor to fight and to the death and finish one another. So thirdly, I think there can also be different ways we can create these things. When will it happen? We think it can happen every quarter, but secondly, you can also make a request to be able to use this mechanism, and I think that's fine. Thirdly, how will we do it? We will vet people. I think that's fairly simple. Why will we vet people? For example, there can be a pro category for professionals where people can be able to compete there regularly. Other people will be vetted based to just to like frame out some arguments from up. Minorities, for example, poor people. If you're doing this for the sake of money, we will not allow you. Just also, we can have an equity committee for this, just to make sure it's fair and no exploitation happens. So just to make sure that the fighting, like me as a 110 kg person won't fight a 50 kg person. I think also to make sure the weapons used are symmetric. I think just these things, financial incentives are going to be necessarily protected. Ratings and access, meaning it's going to be necessarily 18 plus. I don't think I need to say this. Basically, grudge matches, we can have grudge matches where poor people and rich people have a fight in case there is a corporation versus poor people. They can have this. I think basically what I'm saying is that we can have so many categories of this, and I think that's fine. CEO. Oh. These people are wasting your time. All right. Is my time like I can't hear anyone?
Yeah, can you hear me now? Sorry, you seem cut off.
We can pause the timer while you take a POI because they didn't respond.
Guys, I've taken like 30 seconds waiting for that. Anyway, what's the POI?
Just to be clear, if people are going to die, are they unable to at least profit off their potential death?
Yes, I said there's a financial incentive. We can create financial incentives. I think I made that very clear. Secondly, there are no rules. You can fight to the death if you want. I think that's basically fair. You don't have to fight to the death, but you can if you want. Anyway, why would we do this? Necessity. 3 arguments. Firstly, I think there is very importantly, first, the entertainment value. We think that these things can have an entertainment value and therefore could necessarily benefit society. Why is entertainment important? I think entertainment brings people joy. Considering the material conditions in which a lot of people live in today, people necessarily have to fight, engage in capitalistic structures, are very, very, very overworked. There are so many things that make people unhappy. Anything that could bring joy, I think, is something that we think could be a net good. Secondly, there could be a level of accountability that comes out of this. I think we think that for too long, the rich people have used the systems of government and the structures that they can be able to manipulate in the justice system to deny certain people justice. This is not a place you can necessarily manipulate, considering that it's just you and the person who you're fighting with, and that necessarily means that there's a huge breaking down of the barriers towards justice that could exist in society today. Why is this important? A lot of minorities have been denied justice, and we think putting in your request, because in my model I said there are people who can put in requests, and necessarily if your request is picked, we can do it through lottery. You can be able to get justice in a way that doesn't deny you access to that justice, such as you would in a justice system where you have to get lawyers, you have to go through courts, you have to deal with judge biases. I think that's specifically important. Therefore, this also acts as a disincentive for the rich people to subjugate the poor. Also, I think this reduces the amount of people we lose in wars, because I think it's a very effective mechanism. I mean, if you watch some of the best movies like in the Bible, David and Goliath, instead of the Palestinians and the Israelites killing each other, all of them, they just brought each of them their best person. Whoever killed the other won the war. Those are the type of rules that this dueling could necessarily give. We get a maple in net utility from losing a lot of human beings in wars, throwing nuclear bombs. We can settle conflicts between states. And what you need to realize about this is that this is binding. I don't think this debate functions if the result of this war or whatever duel you give is not binding. So instead of going to court, whatever decision can be made, for example, there's a battle between Kenya and Somalia now, instead of probably going through 12 years of the International Court of Justice, we can do this. This could reduce the amount of interstate conflict, or even if it increases it, it largely reduces the amount of people we lose or net, and that's not something I think that is a bad thing. Thirdly, I think, let me just engage preemptively everything that's coming from up. Firstly, they're going to tell you that this glorifies violence and this is a bad thing. They need to engage how society already glorifies violence. We already watch UFC, you have UFC, you have WWE, you have pop culture that glorifies all these violence. So society already glorifies this violence using other mechanisms. I don't think anything specifically changes. Probably this increases it, but I think in a way that it doesn't really change the incentives of society to want to probably preference towards peace, because we think there are also incentives that glorify that, things like religion, society. I mean, there are so many things that influence and like try and get you to be less violent. So these things will just counter each other. The other thing they'll tell you is that the state needs to maintain a monopoly of violence, and that's a good thing. Firstly, the state isn't always the best actors and sometimes uses its monopoly of violence and its monopoly of systems of justice, because that's the other thing that the state has monopoly over, to necessarily subjugate against specific groups, removing those barriers for those who opt into it. Also, very important note, it's not replacing the justice system. For those who opt into this, I think this is fine. You can make that request. Thirdly, the worst case where people can necessarily die, and I think that's something that people can be able to argue from up. We tell you that in this debate, most of the actors have consented. And in this situation, I think what you must specifically realize here is that human beings things are only as valuable as much as human beings preference them. For example, death to some people might be a bad thing, but if you ask a martyr, death is not probably a bad thing. We think there is no inherent wrong with people dying to the extent that they could be able to preference this and opt into this. I think that's fine. I think that world exists like that. Legitimacy, probably a few engagements here. One, consent. I think it's fairly clear that there will be a level of consent to these fights. I think it will always be an option that people can be able to opt into, and I think that's fine. Of course, there's going to be an argument that maybe some people might not be able to opt into, therefore the solving of the power asymmetry and the minority-majority argument will not exist. I think the answer here is that we can make an exception to those, because I genuinely love those fights personally. I think those ones need it more than anything. Therefore, in situations where the minority actor is probably much more subjugated than anyone else, for minorities, we don't have to use consent for the rich people. I think that's fine. We can be able to give them that exception in order to accrue the benefits that I'm talking about. But for everything else, the interpersonal duels, the grudge matches, maybe between me and any of you, I think those ones need consent. I think that's fairly clear. The benefits that come to our side, we think there's already a preferable utility on our side. We think when people can be able to benefit financially, because I said when we broadcast to these things, I think we can sell ads, we can do whatever it is that we want to do to be able to get financial incentives for these people. To the extent that I could get a utility out of this, I think that's fairly okay. Regardless of the harm, I've already consented into that, and I think that's fine. Why is this justified? For those, again, as I've said, who have been denied justice, I think this is okay. Two, justice is only as preferable as society necessarily values it. In some societies, penance were justice. In certain societies, work was justice. In certain societies, jail is justice. Justice can be whatever we like model it to be. And for as long as there's an outcome that is favorable and both people have opted into it, I think that's fine. What are then the maybe two just general impacts that come out of our case? Firstly, this is basically advanced dispute resolution mechanisms. That's basically what this is. So in this case, we get people who can be able to sort out their disputes in a very quick and efficient mechanism that doesn't take too long and doesn't involve too many actors. We think human beings have designed different ways of solving disputes, some non-confrontational, some confrontational. Why is confrontational better? Because it's conclusive. The result is conclusive and involves you and no other third parties. Therefore, it's a justice that we preference. Human satisfaction could also come out of this. Thank you.
We thank the speaker for a fine speech. Could we please have leader opposition? Hear, hear.
Man, I really don't know whether to say funny shit or be serious, but I'll try. It's hard. All right, starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, there's a reason why remnants of the Dark Ages are still remnants of the Dark Ages, because they're tremendously disrespectful to the basic human dignity that must all adhere that we all must adhere to. It weaponizes the poverty of the poor, and it disrespects them, and it treats them like mere means to an end. For all those reasons, we beg to oppose. But what do we get from opening government? The first thing that we get is that this has an entertainment value, so this is cool. First, there are thousands of other forms of entertainment at your disposal. I would posit that the 21st century is the best time to keep yourself entertained because of all sorts of different things that you can do with your time, because you have access to internet, because you can do all sorts of things that will guarantee you entertainment. What is unique about this sort of entertainment that you just can't get out of anywhere else? And if beating the hell out of people brings you joy, then you might watch UFC. Then you might ask, what is the difference between UFC and this? The difference is UFC has laws. It is putting increasing safety regulations in place to respect human dignity and to ensure that the bare minimum of safety is ensured. All of these things are what makes UFC just and this unjust. But if anything entertaining is okay, then would you be also okay with bringing back the primitive culture in Rome that involved throwing Christians to the lion in the Colosseum? I think you'd be fine with that as well if entertainment is your metric. But then they say, it reduces deaths in war. The point is, states will not fight wars through this. Wars are geopolitical in nature. Wars are not, you killed my father, so I will kill you. Those are not wars. Geopolitical gains cannot be attained through these means, so wars will probably take place anyway. Then they say, but this will remove barriers to seek justice. First, you can only fight the rich if they want to fight you, assuming it's a poor versus rich duel that they're settling. But the point is, the rich will just hire another poor to fight the battle for you. And laws exist to prevent people from killing each other. If this is justice, then why not just remove all laws altogether? But now coming to the biggest idea of consent and how we break consent. The first reason why consent is vitiated is because of how media and pop culture will treat it. This will get a lot of online traction and media glorification. This will appeal to masculine standards that are toxic in nature, like you are macho, you can fight it. And this will create a sort of need for men to go in and show their bravado and sacrifice their lives. Second, and this is taken from their point of how they settle group duels. I think most of these group duels and most of these state duels are going to be fought along racial lines. And therefore, people of your race will egg on you as a warrior to go and fight for the legacy of your race, to defend the glory of your state, to defend the glory of your nation. And those are extremely coercive pressure that these certain, you'll have to face as a warrior to deal with it. The third pressure is financial in nature. For poor people, this is one of the easiest ways to make quick money. And this is why most poor people in their world will give up their jobs and train 2 to 3 years to fight just one duel, because they think winning this one duel will give them enough savings for the rest of their lives. As a result of this, when this person will probably die, and there's a 50% chance you die in this, their families will get massively screwed over because their breadwinner has died, and they have no recourse to recompensate for that. The fourth reason why consent isn't there is because of a lack of foresight, right? All of us have a survivorship bias. We see people who have succeeded and we think that because these people succeeded, these may be the only people. We don't see failure, and we are optimistic in nature. Because of that, we're going to overestimate our chances of success there. Second, we cannot foresee pain. If I went out in street today and offered $100,000 to a person to give up their arm, they would probably give up their arm, but they would not think about how much pain it causes, because you just cannot envision yourself suffering that pain when you're making that decision, because the reward is so lucrative in nature. Why is this important? Because the state does not allow you to commit suicide, to sell yourselves into slavery. Why? Because we put the highest premium on the right to life, as all of our rights are contingent upon us having lives in the first place. Therefore, even if consent is not vitiated, even if consent is there, I don't have autonomy to commit suicide. I don't have autonomy to sell myself into slavery. Why? Because this is a fundamental disrespect to human life, and it takes away my right to life, something that I cannot surrender, something that no moral course allows me to do so. Now coming to why humans will become it's extremely dehumanizing in nature. This is dehumanizing in nature because humans become slaves to the pleasures of others. People are taking entertainment from the loss of lives of someone else. This is different from war because of the purpose that this has. Wars are not purposefully oriented to give pleasure out of deaths. Wars are fought for different reasons. They have different geopolitical and nationalistic purposes. The entire purpose of this is lots of people get lots of fun because one person is getting their heart ripped to shreds because there's no law. You can literally claw at each other. You can like throw a dagger at each other's eyes. You can gouge each other's eyes out, and all of this for mere pleasure, because you use these warriors as mere means for entertainment, and the victors are encouraged to disrespect the losers. All of this means there's a tremendous disrespect on their side. You only seek animalistic pleasure and bring back carnal pleasures because there is no laws that prevent you from doing so. I'll take CG if they have anything. CG? All right, OG?
Right.
All right,
CG.
nothing. Yeah, CG, go.
All right. We think your survival bias is entirely untrue. It is completely opposite, because the biggest fear we have is the loss of life, right? That's why even if you think like vaccines have some side effects, a lot of people refuse to take that.
All right. Who do you see in the media? Do you see people who died, or do you see people giving interviews after they succeeded? You see people give interviews after they succeeded. And even if we hate losing life, for the poor, they're living in dire straits and they have no other way to make quick money. When you give them this option, they're more likely to take it. This is the same as giving me a chance to go to the street and offer 100,000 to every single person and tell, can I take your eye out right now because I need your eye? This is tremendously dehumanizing. But let's just look at the history of it. In ancient Rome, these wars were mostly fought by slaves, and the poor used to do this the most. Poor people are still going to do this. What is the harm of this? The media presence and the media coverage of this will confirm stereotypes of violence against the minorities. This will show blacks as brutal and merciless, barbaric people who are from the Dark Ages. And this will confirm the right-wing rhetoric and the racial profiling of Black and Latinos in America, because you'll see them, these people, as broadly overrepresented in these violent spheres, and you'll associate them with violence. This massively fucks up the poor. This disrespects humans, and it harks the society back to the darkest ages. We would beg to oppose because it's tremendously dehumanizing in nature. Thank you.
We thank the speaker for a fine speech. Could we?
Hi, am I audible?
Yep, I can hear you.
All right, starting a bit. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Just for context, Opening Government is a team who unironically ran the argument about solving wars through gladiatorial battles, and then did not engage to a single constructive coming from Sadib in his speech, and still claims we have to do a lot to win this debate. I think we're winning the upper house debate in a fucking landslide. Here's 3 comments about Opening Government to take down their case. First, in terms of their entire ridiculous idea about wars, like I don't want to dignify that with a proper response, but I just want you to think that this is the equivalent of saying the Kashmir battle will be solved with a cricket match between India and Pakistan. Like if Shahid Afridi hits the next ball for a 6, Kashmir is yours. But if Jasprit Bumrah balls over 120 kilometers per hour, fuck you, Kashmir is mine. Like that's not how geopolitics works, right? And probably not something that most politicians will consent to. Like most people will probably want something better. So the entire idea of how that brutality causes lives lost being saved is not ultimately a good argument, because I don't think they prove why politicians have an incentive to endorse this. Second, they make this huge deal about how it's different from the Dark Ages because people consent. So few comments here. First, I think the state's responsibility to ban certain things and allow certain things goes beyond what people consent. If you ask people within a region, they'd probably consent to an entire area being lawless, where they could be absolute hippies after like midnight and do whatever the fuck they wanted, and like do like all sorts of real bad shit and like shoplift, etc., etc. People would probably consent to that. But the reason why you don't allow that is because like consent is not the by-all and end-all of everything. There is a third-party harm that's taken into account. But more importantly, here the right to life is important, because first, I think people, and like this is the equivalent that Sadid tried to bring up, like states don't allow you to commit suicide because that leads to guaranteed death. States don't allow you to kill other people because that is like taking away the right to life of someone else. So like I don't think like the idea here is consent is everything. But more importantly, why do we think the right to life trumps all all other forms of consent and everything else. Because recognize that all rights that exist in society exist to protect the right to life. Like if you think about traffic laws, they exist so that people don't like do traffic accidents and kill off other people. Or if you think like why militaries exist, they exist to protect people. Or why like any law for that matter exists for social safety and security, they exist so that people can live so that they can access all other forms of right. But most importantly, because we've proved that there exists a severe amount of coercion that eludes people's ability to consent to this matter, I think it's inherently immoral. But for all of these reasons here and the analysis that I just gave, I just showed you that even if people consent, this is not the only metric that should be used. Other people and third-party harm should be taken into account. And by the way, why am I saying third-party harm? Because the people who consent are probably going to consent out of like being like ridiculed, being like eluded by a lot of other like overestimation biases that the media is going to portray just so that they can broadcast more and more of these matches. This means a lot of poor people will actively take this high risk, high reward sport and screw over their families in the process. A lot of like people will be racially agitated and want to join in the sport because they want to beat that white motherfucker up. And I think these are the things that are going to lead people into making really, really terrible, irrational decisions that are going to lead to third-party harm for their entire community. So insofar as all of that is true, even if people consent, that's not true. Next, let's come to why people can't actually consent. First, because let's realistically think, who are the people that's likely to do this? As closing government correctly points out, the thing that they want, that the most people will likely opt in, even by knowing that there is a high risk of death, are people who are really desperate, people who would probably get killed off otherwise if they can't have a debt to pay, or people who are thinking of committing, like who are like trying to like get out of really bad situations in life, or people who really need to like save their family or otherwise they're going to die of starvation. Most of these people will end up choosing this and will forego all other things. This looks like poor people often giving up their capacity to get into jobs because they would spend otherwise the time training for the next gladiatorial battle 1 year later. So their families are screwed over in the process. Second, who are you likely to see in the media? This is similar to, let's say, when people climb Mount Everest. We are more likely to know about the people that went to the summit instead of the millions of people who died over the years. This is because the media has a tendency to show people who succeeded. So this is how it creates a success bias, which leads to more and more people thinking that if they could do it, I could probably do it too, because I hold similar characteristics. Third, a lot of these things are actively going to be hidden by the media because they don't want to actively show the brutality of it, because media literally benefits from there being more matches to broadcast, more people coming in, more the industry growing as a whole. This means the media has an active incentive to get more people in it. Insofar as all of that is true, the media has an active incentive to delude you into thinking that this is somewhere you can actively consent in. The last thing, and this is that the fact that a lot of these things will be racially agitated. The fact that like a lot of racial battles, etc., like opening government literally claim will be solved through this, because you think this is a proxy for you to take out your like rage on other people. And this is what I think is extremely problematic. And here's why the most important argument from the debate from Sadid was absolutely dropped by the DPM, causing opening government to like go out of this debate. Because I think the fact that most poor people and racial minorities are likely to subscribe to this is a massive harm that we should try and prevent regardless of whether they have consent. The harms are as follows. First is that this gives the rich and powerful within the media or the populace within the politics the active avenue to tell people that, look, poor people are poor because of the stupid decisions that they make. The fact that they literally wanted to give up their life by killing their killing themselves so that their families can live. We would probably never make that decision. Look at how they are the ones that this is making the decision. This reinforces the narrative that poor are really stupid and this is why they die. Second, these are probably people who are going to be minorities because of their lack of social safety nets, etc., which drives them to bad financial conditions in the first place. This gives politicians the ability to say that, look, poor people are inherently brutal, they're inherently evil, which is why we should have more xenophobic policies. All of that is actively harmful to all of these people. Before moving on, closing government, do you have anything? All right, opening. Yeah.
All right, in the status quo, we already legalized violent sports like throwing doors, all of that things. We think that principally consistent here.
Yeah, that's not principally consistent at all, because Sadid tells you how there's a limit to which people can do this. In UFC or in wrestling, people don't die. People don't actively have a high risk, high reward. Like all of these gladiatorial battles are literally guaranteed death for at least one people. And insofar as all of that is true, you can't enter this. But second, a lot of these violence or self-harm procedure has a high barrier of entry. You can't gamble in casino bars unless you have a certain amount of money already, which prevents a lot of poor people from coming in. Or you can't enter UFC unless you're sponsored by a lot of people who train you for years to to come. Most of these people aren't poor and who are desperate, but these gladiatorial battles are likely to have low barriers to entry, which is why it's going to be even more coercive for all of these people. Lastly, Saadat also tells you how this is going to be worse for women, because vast majority of the people opting in will likely be men. And this reinforces the narrative that most of these people who are coming in are men. This means most men are brave. This puts the feminist movement in a conundrum. Like, do they really support this or do they really oppose this? By supporting it, they can force feminist movements to have a higher threshold of being a feminist. But if they oppose this, they have a tendency to look like they're cowards and whatnot. But all of this, what has opening opposition proved? One, that it is principally immoral for all of the bad historical narratives attached with it, but also because of how immoral it is to dehumanize individuals. But second, we showed you even if people consent, the people consenting are really the most vulnerable, and we should protect them. For all of those reasons, vote opening opposition.
Hi, can you hear me? Yep. Okay, I would like to apologize for the NQ background. It's because Sean is missing the game. He's very upset. All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I first want to deal with the CG argument on black markets. There are a few responses that I want to give to this extension. Number one, at the end of the gladiatorial battle, you die, uncertain how exactly things get worse in the black market. 2, if your delta in this debate is that you can escape the arena and save your life, presumably we can't rely on people being able to run away from the arena. 3, presumably this suggests we should clamp down more on the black market. If you legalize this, this is probably going to actually be deprioritized by the police. 4, the truth is just that, if you really wanted the kind of ruthlessness that the CG talks about, then presumably these black markets will exist on either side. It is uncertain why they would go to your legal arena. I think that CG dealt with. All right. Let's talk about the opening exchange. I think the issue here is that opening only discusses the debate at an atomistic level that deals with random questions that are quite ambiguous about human nature and the notion of whether an individual can truly consent to something. A lot of this analysis premises itself upon individualistic discourses and individualistic calculuses, of which we don't think that we can actually make determinative decisions on. But I think what is really important here, however, is that when we begin negotiations on things like the value of life, when we legalize something, what we are actually doing is we're making a decision on behalf of society for what we consider to be acceptable behavior about when we can take a life and how we can gain the actualization that the CG argues is something that's good for individuals. Which means that this deep and amazing motion that the Edge Court has said is actually a debate about the moral standards of our humanity. And I think that's what we need to focus on when we talk about the impacts in this debate. So what exactly is our extension? We're going to explain to you, one, why principally speaking, this speaks horrendous things about how we are as a culture and society. And secondly, we're going to explain why the practical outcomes of this particular entertainment go far beyond just the notion of dwelling within that arena. The first thing to note is, I think that this results in a regression of humanity as a whole. In the past, the reason why gladiatorial battles were allowed in the first place is because we used to know human life as being hierarchical and dispensable, which is to say that over time we began to realize that the common humanity that we share is actually far more important, and we ought to prioritize intangible things like, for example, the right to life, our capacity to be happy, the avoidance of suffering, and etc., beyond utile outcomes like our entertainment, like our role in society, and the like. That is the reason why we've seen an upsurge of things like more compassion and more international aid that's been giving out to individuals, and why we've outlawed things like gladiatorial battles, why there's increasing backlash against things like the UFC and the WWE, for instance. So, for example, we reduce civilian casualties in war because we recognize that individuals ought not just be construed as a utile outcome in terms of being able to win a war, but rather there is something shared and something deeper that we need to care about. Why does this regress this particular notion? This policy regresses everything we have earned so far, because what it says is that we because what we do is that we can no longer respect humanity, as we are now making their literal lives the subject of entertainment in a violent show of what is grotesque masculinity and brutality. This means that we are saying that individuals can be put up for display, that their lives can be the gamble, that their lives can be put up for losses, for the purview of everyone else involved, just so that we can have a little bit of fun. I think this regresses the idea that human beings have an inherent value and says that some human beings can be worth less than others, that as humanity as a whole, we can be legitimate in celebrating the violent and brutal death of an individual. This is important because I think it also creates divides among individuals. And this is where I deepen the analysis from OO, which I don't think they actually gave. What we say is that the people that are going to consent to this are often, as they suggested, the poor. But the issue with this, however, is not just that they are socio-economically intertwined with other individuals, but rather that this reinforces the identity characteristics that are visible and identifiable among people in the audience, which means that you create a very pernicious and insidious, but ultimately subconscious impact on the way that we value the lives of these people who are poor and those identifiable characteristics that exist there. Here's the crucial analysis that OO misses out. I think we need to characterize how human beings conceptualize of each other, because the truth of the matter is our respect for humanity is not a rational construct that we can think about every day, that we that we rationally decide when we want to give to charity whether or not it's something that's good or bad. But rather, respect for humanity is actually a result of norms. It's something that is subconscious and exists deep within the purview of an individual's soul. What happens then is that it demeans the sacrifice right now that we have to help the poor elsewhere, because what happens is individuals and human beings are separated by epistemic inexcess, which means that people are actually just genetically and more likely to be wired to care about those people who are the most proximate around them. The notion of a common humanity, however, is something that as a society we need to safely and jealously guard, because it requires a leap of faith and operates at a subconscious level of a norm that compels people to act against their better judgment and against their personal benefit in order to help someone else that's far away, someone else that is suffering. This particular policy of the gladiatorial battle, in terms of saying that people can now be instruments of entertainment in the course of their lives, regresses the capacity of any norm to be created that says that human beings have to respect the right to life and reduce suffering regardless of anything else, that this is something that needs to be irrationally ingrained in the minds of everyone. I'll take one from the OG.
I argue, because you can't say I didn't say it, that human life or anything that we value is preferenced by what humans see at that time. So things that are valuable are based on human preferences. Why can't human preference derogating the right to life? Because it's not an absolute good. That's what OP is missing. You can't say it's an absolute good. If people preference and consent, why is it wrong?
If you listen to what my analysis was earlier, what I was saying is that it is obviously true that to some extent human beings have some capacity to be able to negotiate what they think is good or bad, but that these things are also norms that need to be checked and need to be controlled, and that there ought to be some sort of a moral standard, some sort of an objective and more rational discussion about what is good or bad. This particular policy, and the problem I think on the Gulf is that you assume a static conception of humanity and a static choice that is currently being made. But the truth is this policy regresses these things to a worse extent, and it affects humanity in a way that the middle people conceptualize of humanity in a way that is ultimately pernicious and problematic for them. But also just the idea of like suffering and the like, for example, like you obviously preference your proximate people, but we need to preference people who are outside as well. Moving on to what we think the practical impact of this is. I think Wafi was hilarious when he talked about cricket. Not that I really understand it, but I agree that's not how geopolitics works. But here's why it's worse. On our side, what happens now is that every time Pakistan and India goes into a gladiatorial battle, what happens is that these interstate conflicts take on a proxy projection in the form of this gladiatorial battle that is not just about sport, not about the fair play, not about the respecting the rules of the game, but about the bloody murder of someone else that I think is uniquely crafted in a way that is gamified to arouse the kind of us versus them mentality and passion that we see in things like football, for example. That's when you allow people like Modi to be able to utilize these kinds of nationalistic sentiments to make interstate conflict that much worse. That you roll up nationalism in a way that cannot be detracted on, that destroys diplomacy. We're incredibly happy to oppose this violent debate.
Thank the speaker for a fine speech. Could we please have the winner? Here.
Excuse me. 1 second. Let me start my timer. Yeah, again, like I have to claim ahead that my network connection here is really bad. So if I lost connection, just stop right away and let me know. All right. My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Panel, there are just people in our societies who love to experience violence. Someone can be satisfied with movies like John Wick or Jason Bourne. Somebody can be satisfied with WWE. Somebody can be satisfied with boxing and UFC. But there are just some people who like to watch people bleed and even die in the arena. These are the group of people who actually actively participate in hundreds of underground arenas around the globe and attend the broadcast in different channels of darknet. We agree with part of analysis coming from Charmaine closing observation that these principles are really bad. But as for the impact, in order to prevent such brutal and bloodshed happen globally around where the opposition side failed to provide any alternative to spend it, it is only coming from the closing government. And at least we give you a system that, number one, can actually reduce the majority casualty of these poor people, but number two, bring more check and balance and mercy into the system that can actually serve the purpose of humanity, as closing opposition mentioned. Two responses to the closing opposition's rebuttals. Number one, okay, she argued that the police will actually deprioritize these underground arena stuff. No, we don't believe that is true. The principle here, the reason here is really, really simple, because when the government actually legalize these like fighting arenas, broadcast on the internet, it actually make it a competitor product with these underground arenas. So for the GDP, or at least for the income of this broadcast show, it actually gives financial incentive for the government, or at least the companies who run this show, to lobby the government to give more KPI to the police to stop broadcasting on dark night or in underground arenas, simply because they're competitors. And number two, it is exactly the sale challenge that there could be underground arenas exist in both sides of the world. But as we proved to you, then at least we could reduce the number of poor people dying in the underground arenas, because people would actually much more prefer the competitor product we provide to the public. For example, for very simple reasons, because in order to attend like the underground arena, you probably have to pay like hundreds of dollars to get the ticket into the arena, at least to darknet. But in our side of the world, you probably just have to endure 30 seconds of YouTube advertisement to experience exactly the same thing that, or very similar things, would happen in darknet or underground arena. That is the reason why that in the real world, that a lot of, at least the majority of the public, especially those who want to experience such violence, would choose our side of product. Number two, this also responds to the opposition's challenge that, oh, there are many alternatives, but why is it unique? Yes, it is unique because, like as we said, there are people who just want to experience bloodshed. They may be a small proportion of this world, but as long as we can save more poor people who actually coerce things in the fight, we can solve this issue. And number two, I think the general problem of opening opposition is that they're actually in lack of imagination on business happening in the real world. Because in our side of the world, as my partner uniquely explained to you, that those who enter our arena are not actually like random poor people, but those who are well trained. For example, like retired soldiers, retired SEALs, or like top assassins, etc., etc. The reason why is not like underground arenas. We're not holding like hundreds of matches around the globe like every week. We probably are going to hold just one match every 2 weeks or a month, just to fit the demand of people who want to enjoy this. This means that there's actually a very high quota, or not quota, there's a limited quota, very high entrance bar for those gladiators to enter the arena. Usually those who are well trained. Again, it actually deterrents for random poor people, because they understand they actually stand no chance against retired SEALs who are very well trained, experienced with combat skills, and very good at killing people. Number three, right here, the opening side also argues that a lot of their arguments are based on the premise that there will be media glorification. We don't think that is true, because imagine if our motion actually took place in real world, we believe that most traditional media and like social media discussions will actually be against our program, be against our show. The reasons are exactly just like what Sherman has against the closing opposition, that this is brutal, this is against humanity. And a lot of, I believe, like traditional media will actually attack the show. So instead of glorifying the breadwinners will actually, all of those media will put a lot of attentions on the suffering of the death or suffering of the injuries, which will again make a lot of like backlashes coming from the open opposition extremely non-realistic. Again, let's engage with the closing oppositions, like just one extension, major extensions, like a principle about humanity and why it is bad. Number one, like let's take their best case and the worst case. And even if we agree with their principle argument, we think we still win on the principle because we reduce casualties of the poor people who actually die in the status quo because of this gladiator arena stuff. But number two, just as my partner has uniquely explained, that the deaths with consent is actually ranked higher than principle coming from the closing opposition. Exactly because, for example, that's the example we mentioned before in this debate, like people do have the right to climb Mount Everest, even there is a very high risk of dying on the mountain because people really actually die every year climbing Mount Everest. There is actually much more people dying playing all kinds of extreme sports every year globally. They might do it for passion. They might do it for reputation. A lot of actually professional, especially like professional sportsmen or players do it for financial incentives. This is all justified in the status quo because we believe that even there's opportunity for you to lose your life, at least you give the consent to yourself etc. We do believe that the meaning of such activities that might lead to death is more important than living a life that prevent you from doing the things you like and love, or out of like realistic reasons. The opening opposition mentioned are like you might want that like do it for financial reasons and you die, and if your family members lose your breadwinners and they're all fucked up. We think that poor people are poor, but they're not stupid, so they can do the basic calculations of how much financial incentives they can bring to their families. But all these reasons, we think that we tackle down all argument of poor people, we tackle down Phil's only argument of principle and humanity. For all these reasons, we take the debate. Thank you very much.
We thank the speaker for a fine speech. And now for the last speech of the tournament, opposition whip. Hear, hear.
Hi, can you hear me? What the fuck?
Yep. Heard that.
You know you're not muted, right?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I just saw Liverpool constituency.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, yeah. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I think the first thing I want to establish in this debate is how I think you should weight this principle consent clash. The claim that comes from opening government at its highest is that this is necessary because it's fairer than society, and it's fairer the monopoly of force that the state has. Therefore, it is legitimate that we have this gladiator contest. I think the first thing to note is that it's entirely unclear to me why individuals would agree to enter these contests where they might die if the comparative is in a context where they have the power to oppress you. I don't think they'll get people in this situation in the first place. But more than that, it's especially unclear why these people are going to win. It's like the movie Rocky, right? You can try for 15 rounds, but at the end of the day, the disparity that they suggest exists is still likely to factor into the gladiatorial arena, which means that you're still likely to lose on that side of the house. More than that, the more people take this on, the less likely I think there's impetus for other forms of dispute resolution at a point which is more coercive and it forces people into this situation. I think therefore, even if they prove that it's unfair, this just isn't the solution. The opening op's response to all this is consent, right? And CG has some input here against this particular argument. I think this entire issue is just not the winning issue in this debate. And the reason for that is a few-fold. The first thing is that nothing in opening proved why this inability to consent was likely to be structural. Why it was likely, insofar as it's likely that some people probably genuinely feel that they are consenting to this decision, and it's not clear understand why opening up has the ability to arbitrarily decide that this impression of consent that people have is in itself illegitimate. I also think that OG should reasonably have some fiat, if not like the motion just doesn't really have a point, right? If like OG has to argue against consent. But further to that, I also think that opening up actually doesn't fill in the analysis for why people, insofar as some people consent and some people don't, the people who don't consent are more important. I think there's argumentative analysis that they fail to provide in those features. But the third thing to note is that Wafi himself concedes that consent is not as important because there are certain instances in which people consent, but we consider other harm to be more important. And therefore, we think even if people consent, we still make certain things illegal. The further thing to note is that these particular other harms are things that other individuals structurally don't consent to. And therefore, I think that there is a need to protect these particular groups of individuals on that side of the house. So if we don't want to, if we suggest that this consent clash and all that is not the way in which this debate is ultimately going to be adjudicated, I think the question therefore turns to how this policy is likely to rejig our conceptualization of morality and how we see each other. And this is where I think Shermai's extension is incredibly clear and incredibly important. She argues that what this does is that it makes us reduce the extent to which we value life writ large on a broader scale, right? It makes us see life as a commodity, something that can be weighted, something that can be easily traded off for something as fickle and unimportant as our casual entertainment. I think what she further argues to you is that entertainment is, that this conception of seeing it for entertainment, the fact that the way that the masses engage with this particular activity is going to be by watching it on your TV screens, or watching it in a bar and shouting about it, uniquely makes it likely that this is the way in which we are going to change our morality. And this is where I deal with my most important refutation in this debate. The claim from Wafi in chat that Liverpool is the smallest club in Merseyside. The reality at the end of the day is that what makes this is that the reason why Liverpool is one of the most well-supported clubs, and a club that says that it's like more than just a club, right? That this means more, is because of the narratives that they try to push out within this club. The fact that, for example, they talk about the togetherness that is incredibly important, the morals that stand behind, like being a working class club defending a working class city in that context. And the reason why this go through is because that because ultimately the difference is that you are bought into the entertainment value of the club, you buy into the narratives that exist and the excitement that exists, and in that moment, especially given the toxic masculinity you leave behind within what is ultimately going to be seen as a sporting venture, what that means is that you're uniquely open and vulnerable to taking in these ideas uncritically because of the extent to which you buy into this. That is why supporting Liverpool means more than supporting like Chelsea. So, to that degree, if we believe that therefore there is some change in the way in which you're likely to weight life, what does this mean in the context of the debate? The argument that you get from opening government is we just don't care about life, right? They make this primarily in POI, and I think it's problematic because I think the analysis for this massive claim is just not actually given on that side of the house. But more critically, I suggest that this is problematic insofar as we recognize that some people just don't partake equally within these conversations. Some people are like, if they are not able to, like, for example, be a significant voice within a decision to allow this, or they don't know the implications of these particular policies on that side of the house. But more than that, all of the impacts that Shermai talks about suggest that what this does, that it extends beyond the individual decision to care about the individual life that enters the arena to the broad way in which we treat other individuals, things like IHL, things like the extent to which we care about charity, welfare, for example, are all things that we may not be able to conceptualize and consent into, but also things that have externality impacts that you don't consider on that side of the house. OG.
Morality is not an objective concept, but subjective. To the extent that what is inherent good, you need to prove the inherent good of life. But more importantly, the state subscribes minorities at a mass scale and sends them to war for their own nationalistic incentives. Why is this any different than people opting into this themselves?
Three responses. One, I think the extent to which we go to war is incredibly limited, and we do this with like states that are consented into being created. We also do our best to minimize death within these contexts. Unlike this, second, I suggest that at best on your side of the house, it's likely that I think many individuals don't partake in this consent or discussion on what morality is. Third, I think the intuition that life is important is more likely than the intuition that life is unimportant and something that we can anyhow trade away. And that's something I think you guys needed to prove. The opening up claim is we are going to see third party harm, and I think the direct comparison needs to be made here. Their claim is, the first thing they suggest is that things like suicide are currently banned. I don't think the link on why suicide is a problem exists, and that's a link that actually Shermai proves when she tells you about the conception of life and why the way in which you change the conception of life and how that hurts vulnerable individuals is likely to change. So I think that's our argument. The next thing they argue is poor people, and there's several ways to take this. The first thing they suggest is that poor people make bad decisions. One, I think it's entirely unclear in those speeches why it's structurally bad for these individuals and why they can't choose to incur this risk. The comparative that we suggest is that the risk that we tell you in Sherman is a risk that they structurally can never quantify, and that it's going to affect them in more ways than they even know, and therefore we think that these implications from outside are significantly more important. But second, on this thing of how they see the poor, the first thing I want to note is that the OG does say that you might glorify the poor, so it's unclear how this particular argument from OO is won by them. But I also think that the question is about seeing this about their life worth. It is independent of the valued judgment of the individual decisions. It is inherent to the way in which we see every single poor individual in society, and it affects even the less judgmental people of individual decisions, because this is about your broad conception of humanity writ large. The implication of this is that the degree to which it affects people is significantly greater insofar as our analysis exists for the way in which you conceptualize morality and the way in which you conceptualize life. Even if I take the worst case scenario, the black market in closing gov, the fact that we socially reject this and we make this illegal means that at least our morality for the majority of individuals who don't access this particular form of black market stays the same. We protect the very morality of individuals and the conception that the less privileged lives are important. That's something we are incredibly proud to propose.
We thank the speaker for their speech. We thank all teams for an absolutely wonderful final. All right, so we're waiting on Z to open breakout rooms, and then all panelists follow B to